Okay, so I recently found a new thing to obsessively collect, and it's in this envelope. Let's check it out. So these are film cells from a bunch of different movies. You know, they're not the negative film that ran through the camera. They weren't actually there on set. Film cells are the positive print that was made when the film was sent out for distribution to theaters. So the good news is that there's, thousands of them out there, because I'm not collecting from like exceedingly rare movies that need access to those prints. And also, like, it's a little bit better than a negative because you can actually see the image on it, and I thought it'd be cool to look through some of these. So let's see what we got here. This is a shot from The Shining, the shot where, Jack is in the photograph at the party. That's a pretty fun one. Ooh, I'm excited about this one. Okay, so this one is from Casablanca, which was a really, really popular movie from the 40s. And what I love about this one is that this little cat who's sticking her head over here, can you say hi? Her actual name is Ingrid Bergman. Oh, Ingrid, oh boy. So anyways, that is my cat right there in film. Here we've got some frames from Toy Story, the very first computer animated feature film from Pixar. Wonderful movie, wonderful, big part of my life. This is a couple frames from The Wizard of Oz of Dorothy laying in some flowers. And I thought this one was fun because it reminds me of that shot from Midsommar when she's got like the flowers all around her that she's laying in. I also really like The Wizard of Oz because it's one of the first iconic movies that a lot of people still really love today. It was a feat of Technicolor, a feat of collaboration, even though they were also basically abusing all of the actors on set. Here we've got a couple of frames from the title sequence of 2001: A Space Odyssey. This one's kind of an interesting one because you can notice some of the properties of 35mm film. Most specifically, you can see that like the image is really, really squished from what you actually know in the movie. It kind of looks like somebody didn't know how to like properly resize an image and they just stretched the height of it. And that's because this was an anamorphic film. So anamorphic films take a special lens that takes a wider field of view and sort of compresses it through like the glass in the lens itself to the standard size of a 35mm frame. And then you print that onto the standard 35mm frame, which is more square than wide. And when you project it back at the theater, you have another lens that reverses that process. The projector unsqueezes it, and then you get that nice wide, cinematic look. You can also see over here on the side, the soundtrack is a lot more prominent during this than some of the other shots that we saw. So you can actually see the waveforms for the soundtrack on the side. But of course, this is just a very, very, very small piece of the soundtrack because we're looking at 5 frames here. And remember, a feature film is 24 frames per second. So this is just a blip, a moment. That's the title sequence from 2001. And along with that, we've got the ship from 2001 orbiting Earth. It's interesting because it came out during the space race, and of course everybody was obsessed with space, but we hadn't actually cemented our place on the moon yet, and we were still kind of like understanding what it took to live in space. But the space station is still very similar today to what you see a lot of people talk about if we want to have sort of like long-term space stations to inhabit, which is that they spin around and generate their own artificial gravity. This one's a classic. This is where you put on the true film bro hat. This is a collection of frames from Pulp Fiction. Oh my god, wow, Quentin Tarantino, suck my dick. Look, okay, I agree that Pulp Fiction is a good film, but also I think it's incredibly overhyped, and I respect Quentin Tarantino, but he is also nowhere near the top of my director list. So honestly, like when people tell me that like Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill is their favorite movie, I kind of just like get a little bored with that conversation. But hey, it's a good movie and we got some good frames from it here. Okay, that's all that matters. These are some frames from sort of an early music documentary film called Woodstock. It was assembled out of footage that was shot during the 1969 Woodstock Festival. And so I'm not gonna lie, I haven't actually seen this documentary yet, and I really should. But one of the reasons this one makes me excited, why I think this is a cool film, is because in my day-to-day job, I design filmmaking software, and Woodstock was one of the first feature-length films that was cut using a digital process. Not fully digital, because, you know, obviously it was still on film, but they did a large part of the post-production process using some old digital NLEs, or I guess they weren't even NLEs, they were probably some kind of linear editor, and that allowed them to do some really cool stuff with sort of like compositing that was really difficult to do in film. And in fact, actually, I haven't seen this yet, but if you look at this frame right here, you can see exactly what I'm talking about, which is that this frame is like split in half, showing one shot on the left side and another shot on the right side. And when this documentary was cut, that was a pretty labor-intensive process to do manually. So digital editing has come a long way, because not only is that split screen so easy, but it's sort of like a foundational part of the language of cinema now. Hey, yeah, okay, so I was actually totally wrong about this. I went back and looked at some of my notes about the history of video editing, and it was not done digitally at all. It was done on a KEM machine, but the significant part was that this was one of the first productions this large to use a KEM machine, and they did it because they had all of this film footage of different sizes from different cameras. They were doing 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, 35 millimeter, and the modular structure of a KEM made it really easy to work with that. And so this ended up being a significant production that inspired a lot of other productions to use KEM machines. But the other cool part is that this is the first time that Thelma Schoonmaker and Martin Scorsese worked together. And then it was another 10 years before they worked together again on a film that Scorsese actually directed, and then, you know, Thelma Schoonmaker became his partner. So yeah, the compositions, the split screens were still done analog, and apparently the director hated the idea of doing split screens because he hated them in general, but he was convinced otherwise for this film, and it was really well received. Anyways, quick interjection. Sorry about the inaccuracies, and back to the video. Here's one for the fellow nerds out there. Star Wars. So these are a few frames from the Princess Leia hologram scene. I actually only actually watched the original Star Wars films fairly recently, like 3 or 4 years ago. They're good. They're good. I really appreciate what it was going for at the time, this like larger than life space opera. Not my favorite science fiction though, because I really, really love science fiction, and I was blessed to be born into a time with some really great science fiction. I mean, like, I'm pretty sure there's a poster for Arrival on the wall behind me. Oh wait, no, I took the Arrival one down. But there's Her. Her is incredible. Anyways, Star Wars is great. Happy to be able to own a little piece of this. But I think this is also like an interesting comparison, if we're talking about sci-fi here, to talk about 35 millimeter versus 70 millimeter IMAX. So 35 millimeter is like the most standard Hollywood feature film size. Celluloid film is an analog medium. You're literally etching light into this surface, and that means that you're not beholden to some of the limitations today, where we're also worried about pixels and how many Ks things are going to have in resolution. So 35 millimeter film, this is super, super small, but when you push it through a projector and you have like the right type of magnification on it, you can blow the image up like absolutely huge, and it still looks really well. But then of course we take things a step further with a specialized piece of film like IMAX 70 millimeter. Already you can see a difference here is it's big. IMAX film is big because they make big movies. In fact, one of the ways that's really interesting about the way that they're able to utilize more of the film is you can see the 35 millimeter image sort of runs horizontally compared to film leader. And so if you're talking about an image that is wider than it is tall, you're using less space. Whereas IMAX 70 millimeter film turns the film on the side, so it runs left and right here. And that means that the image uses the smaller size, which would be the height of the film, to take up the smaller size of the celluloid. So the height is determined by how much actual width you have in the film, which means that the length can like take up a larger area. So this is a cell from Interstellar, from the corn chase scene. And I just think it's cool, you know, like a single film cell, a single frame of IMAX 70 millimeter film is like almost like a little Polaroid in its own right, which is also why it's fucking expensive to shoot. And while we're on the subject of 70 millimeter IMAX, this is one of my favorites. This is so cool. One of the things that IMAX was always really, really good at doing is they had all those like partnerships with museums and things where they would show all their giant films. And I guess this is a frame from a film about human space exploration, and specifically from the setup of the International Space Station. I don't actually know exactly what the film is, but like this is such an incredible shot. Like, can I zoom in anymore? Yeah, like look at, there's the whole Earth there. And then there's the whole space station there, you know, basically the only outpost that we have in space. And yet, beyond that, we just had a dude with an IMAX camera filming it and getting this incredible frame. I love this. I really, really love this one. These are a handful of frames from Inception, which I've seen so many times. Pretty much everybody in film has like those movies that made them really want to get involved in film. And I very distinctly remember walking out of the theater after seeing Inception in 2010 in Park City, Utah, and just being like, movies, man. So these are particularly fun to have. So yeah, that's my new obsession, collecting film cells from random movies that I love. You know, it's just like a cool little piece of film memorabilia to own. But yeah, like I said, they just live in this bag because I have no idea how to display them now. So if you know how I could display these somehow, hit me up.